I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Either way, I picked a random spot on the map, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Appalachian wilderness, and decided to hike in as far as I could. No trails, no campsites, just raw forest. I wanted to see if I could get truly lost, if I could push myself to survive out there alone for a few days. I packed light. My old external frame backpack carried the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a basic first aid kit, and a knife. I brought a cheap compass and an old topographic map I'd printed out, but I figured I wouldn't need them. I was comfortable in the woods, had done plenty of solo trips before. This was just another one. I parked my truck off a dirt road, a good 10 miles from the nearest paved street, and started walking. The first few hours were easy: thick underbrush, tall trees, the occasional sign of deer or small game. I felt good. I was moving fast, covering ground. But as I pushed deeper in, the forest changed. The trees grew taller, older. The underbrush thinned out, replaced by layers of fallen needles and moss. The air smelled different: damp, earthy, untouched. There were no signs of people, no old fire pits, no litter, not even old logging scars. It was like stepping into a place that had never been disturbed. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent in a small clearing, built a tiny fire, and ate a cold meal. I listened to the sounds of the woods: crickets, owls, the occasional rustling of small animals. Normal, comfortable. But the next day, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Just a feeling, a vague sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off, kept hiking, pushing deeper into the woods. My goal was to reach a small stream I'd seen on the map, set up camp there for a night, and then start making my way back out. Around midday, I started noticing strange things. The first was the trees. Some of them were marked, not by people, but by deep, wide scratches, long parallel gouges running up the trunks. Too high for a bear, too clean for weather damage. I stopped and ran my fingers over one. The wood was fresh, the edges of the cut still pale beneath the bark. Whatever had done this, it had been recent. I kept moving. A few hours later, I found a clearing littered with bones. At first, I thought they were deer. Plenty of animals die out here, their remains scattered by scavengers. But as I looked closer, I saw that some of the bones were arranged, almost deliberately. Small ones stacked together, larger ones set apart. A few were stripped completely clean, no signs of weathering, no gnaw marks from animals, like they'd been boiled or scraped down. I felt a tightness in my chest, but forced myself to stay calm. Maybe some kind of predator had been using this spot for years. Maybe it was nothing. I moved on. By late afternoon, I reached the stream. The water was clear, cold, moving fast over smooth stones. I crouched down, filled my bottle, splashed some on my face. The tension from earlier started to fade. This was why I came out here. For the quiet, the solitude, the untouched beauty of it. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, gathered some wood, and built a fire. As night fell, I felt more at ease. The crackling flames, the rhythmic flow of the stream, the distant hoots of an owl. It was peaceful. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know why. There was no sound, no movement, nothing obvious. Just a feeling, like something had changed. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull orange glow against the tent walls. The stream was still running. The wind had died down. Then I noticed it. The forest was silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. Nothing. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, unnatural. Slowly, I sat up, unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire was low, barely enough to see beyond a few feet. The trees stood motionless, their dark shapes pressing in from all sides. Then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw something move. Not an animal, not a person, just a shape shifting slightly, blending too well with the darkness. It wasn't walking, wasn't crawling, just there like it had always been, just waiting for me to notice. I held my breath. It didn't move closer. It didn't make a sound. It just stayed there, barely visible, just at the edge of my sight. I don't know how long I sat there, staring. Minutes? Hours? The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, the normal sounds of the forest came rushing back. Crickets, the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. The weight in my chest loosened. When I looked again, the shape was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed up and started moving. Fast. I didn't care about the stream, didn't care about the map. I just wanted to put distance between me and that place. But as I hiked, I noticed something worse. The forest wasn't the same. The trees were thicker, the ground uneven. The landmarks I'd passed before, the twisted oak, the rocky outcrop, were gone. It was like the whole place had shifted overnight. And then I found the second campsite. My campsite. The first, I thought I'd walked in circles, but the fire pit was still warm. The embers were fresh. My footprints from the morning were there, clear as day. But my tent was gone, like I'd never been there at all. I didn't stop moving. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I just walked. And at some point, hours later, maybe more, I stumbled out onto the dirt road where I'd left my truck. My legs were shaking, my breath ragged. I half expected the truck to be gone, for the road itself to have disappeared. But it was there. I threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was home. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know if it was something watching me, or if the woods themselves didn't want me there. But I do know this, I'll never go that deep again. Some places aren't meant to be found. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust. The kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me, but I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break. But by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind, just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough. The branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it, The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again, a sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind, but something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. I had been on the road for a long time, longer than I should have been, but that was how it always went. The money was good when the miles were high, and I was used to pushing it. That night, I was running a load of steel coils from Ohio down to Texas. A long stretch, mostly highway, not too many stops except for fuel and maybe a couple of hours of sleep if I could afford the time. The weather had been decent when I left, cold but clear, but the forecast had warned of rain turning to ice the farther south I got. That was the last thing I needed, especially hauling something as heavy as what was on my trailer. The first few hundred miles were uneventful. I ran through Kentucky, then Tennessee, making decent time. Traffic was light since it was late, and I preferred driving at night anyway. Less idiots on the road. I'd seen too many wrecks, too many people cut off an 80,000-pound truck like they had a death wish. I knew better than to get comfortable, though. Long-haul trucking has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and the second you start thinking nothing's going to go wrong, something does. It started just past the Arkansas border. The rain had been falling steady for a while, but the temperature was dropping, and I could feel the road getting slick under my tires. I eased up on the speed, kept a good distance from the few cars still out that late. I was on a long stretch of I-30, mostly trees on either side, no towns or exits nearby. The kind of road that can feel endless when you're tired and alone. My dash lights glowed dimly in the dark, the soft hum of the engine the only sound besides the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Texarkana when I saw the lights ahead, red and blue flashing in the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement. A wreck, I figured, not unusual in weather like this. As I got closer, I saw a line of trucks and cars slowing down, easing into the right lane. A couple of sheriff's cars were parked at an angle, blocking part of the road, and there was a cluster of people standing near the shoulder. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see what had happened. A jackknifed semi sat across the left lane, its trailer twisted at an angle. The cab looked mostly intact, but the front end of a smaller car was wedged underneath it, crushed almost beyond recognition. I could see first responders working around it, but from the way they moved, it was clear there was no saving whoever had been inside. I had seen enough accidents to know what that meant. Traffic was still moving, just slower, and as I crept past, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The semi's trailer was carrying steel coils, just like mine. Heavy loads like that can be dangerous if they're not secured right. If a coil comes loose in a wreck, it'll cut through a cab like a knife through butter. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and told myself to shake it off. No use thinking about it. The rain picked up not long after that, the temperature still dropping. I kept the heat on low, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel too hard, but I couldn't help it. The road was getting worse, patches of ice forming in spots, and I knew I had to be careful. I had another 300 miles to go before I could rest, and the last thing I needed was to end up like that guy back there. An hour passed, maybe more. The road stretched on, dark and empty, the only light coming from my headlights and the occasional glow of another truck in the distance. I was tired, but not enough to stop yet. I just wanted to get through the worst of the weather before I found a place to pull over. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shadow on the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the highway. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes, careful not to lock them up on the ice, and my truck slowed with a groan. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely illuminated by my headlights. My first thought was that it was a stranded driver, someone whose car had broken down. Maybe they had been walking to get help, and I was the first vehicle they had seen in a while. But something felt off. They weren't waving me down. They weren't moving at all. I eased onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop a few yards away. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. I kept my lights on and tried to get a better look at the person. They were dressed in dark clothes, soaked from the rain, their heads slightly tilted down. Something in my gut told me not to get out. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Then, slowly, the person turned and walked toward the guardrail. They climbed over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I waited, staring at the spot where they had gone. The highway was bordered by thick woods in that area, no houses or businesses nearby. If they had a car, it wasn't anywhere I could see. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't about to go chasing someone into the woods in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this. If they needed help, there were better ways to get it than standing in the middle of the road. I reached for my radio and called it in, giving my location and a description of what I had seen. The dispatcher acknowledged it, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than usual. The feeling didn't leave me, that tight, uneasy knot in my stomach. I drove for another hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop near Texarkana. The rain had slowed, but the air was colder, the roads still slick. I parked in the back lot, away from the other rigs, and shut the engine off. My body ached from the tension of the drive, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I sat there for a while, staring at the rain running down the windshield. The night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of another truck pulling in or leaving. I never found out who that person was. The next day, I checked the news, but there was nothing about a stranded driver or anyone found near that stretch of highway. No missing person reports that matched what I had seen. Just another cold, wet night on the road. I finished my run and moved on to the next haul, but I never stopped thinking about it. It wasn't the first strange thing I'd seen out here, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But something about that night stuck with me in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the way they had stood there, unmoving. Maybe it was the way they had just disappeared into the dark. Or maybe it was the fact that when I looked back at my dashcam footage the next morning, there was nothing there. Just an empty highway and the rain. I don't know why I agreed to come up here alone. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I really believed that some time away from everything would do me good. Either way, it was a mistake, a big one. It started with an offer that sounded too good to be true. A friend of a friend had a cabin deep in the woods, barely used anymore. I could stay as long as I wanted, completely free. Just bring my own supplies. No rent, no bills, no distractions. Just nature, solitude, and silence. I packed up a week's worth of food, filled up my truck, and drove 5 hours north. The last part of the trip was all dirt roads, winding through thick trees, no signs, no other cars. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of dark wood, standing in a small clearing. No power, no running water. Just a fireplace, an old gas stove, and a well outside for water. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low. I unloaded my things, locked up my truck, and carried my bags inside. The air smelled damp, like old wood and earth. There was dust everywhere, but the place was solid. The main room had a couch, a wooden table, and a fireplace. A narrow hall led to a tiny bedroom with a stiff old bed and a closet full of forgotten things. A few hunting knives, old boots, a dusty lantern. I ate a quick meal, lit a few candles, and sat in the silence. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees, an occasional creak of the old wood settling. Felt peaceful, but the peace didn't last. I woke up in the middle of the night. No reason, just that strange, sudden wakefulness that leaves you staring at the ceiling. The cabin was silent. No wind, no animals, just a heavy, pressing stillness. Then I heard it. Not loud, not obvious, just a faint sound outside. A slow, steady crunching, like footsteps moving through the trees. I lay still, barely breathing. Could have been a deer or a coyote. Could have been nothing. Then it stopped. I waited, listening. Silence. Minutes passed. I told myself it was nothing, forced myself to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. The morning was cold, and my breath fogged in the air as I stepped outside. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction, thick and dark. I walked to the well, pulled up water, and splashed some on my face. Then I saw them, footprints, clear in the dirt near the tree line, just beyond the clearing. They weren't mine, too far from the cabin, too fresh. They led from the woods to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. No return tracks, just a trail leading toward my cabin, then disappearing. I felt a tightness in my chest. Maybe a hunter? Someone passing through? That had to be it. I spent the day trying to shake the unease, chopping wood, checking my supplies. I had a rifle in the truck, but I hadn't brought much ammo. Should have brought more. Should have thought this through. The day passed slowly. By evening, I was exhausted, but I didn't want to sleep. I forced myself to eat, locked the door, and sat by the fire. The air outside felt heavier, thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fire in the main room had burned down, leaving only faint orange flickers dancing on the walls. Then the noise came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath. They circled the walls, a slow, steady crunch of dirt and dead leaves. I grabbed the hunting knife from the bedside table, gripping it so hard my hand ached. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. A long silence, then the softest creak of wood. The porch. Someone was standing just feet away, on the other side of that thin wooden door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. A long moment passed. Then the footsteps retreated, slow and steady, back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that, just sat in bed, knife in hand, listening to the silence. I checked outside as soon as the sun rose. The footprints were there again, clearer this time. Heavy, deep imprints leading from the trees to my porch. I wanted to leave, should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, searching for any sign of who was out there. No trails, no campsites, just untouched forest. I went back inside, locked the door, and spent the day trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Then I found something in the closet, an old hunting jacket. Nothing strange about it until I checked the pockets. Inside, wrapped in a crumpled piece of cloth, was a set of keys. Not cabin keys, car keys. I pulled out the cloth and unwrapped it completely. Something else fell out. A tooth. Human. My stomach turned. I dropped the cloth, stepped back, tried to think. Whoever had stayed here before me, something had happened to them, and now it was happening to me. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, waiting. The fire burned low. Then, past midnight, I heard it again. But this time, it was different. No footsteps, just breathing, right outside my window. Slow, deep, steady. Someone standing just inches away, separated by only thin glass. I tightened my grip on the rifle. Then the doorknob rattled, hard. I stood up, heart pounding, aimed the rifle at the door. Silence. Then a single knock. Slow, hollow. Then another. Then silence. I stood there, frozen, gun shaking in my hands. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Whoever it was, they were gone. I didn't wait for nightfall. At first light, I grabbed my bags, loaded the truck, and got the hell out. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first gas station, miles away. I told the clerk about the cabin. He looked at me, quiet for a moment, then just shook his head. "That place," he said, "no one's been up there for years." I asked him who owned it. He shrugged. "Used to be a guy, lived up there alone. Then one day he just never came back." I asked what happened. He looked at me, then at the keys I'd placed on the counter. "Where'd you find those?" I didn't answer. I just left, and I never went back. I didn't go looking for trouble. I never do. But somehow it always finds me. This time, it found me in a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with no phone service and no one around to hear me scream. I had rented the place for a week, thinking it would be the perfect way to clear my head. Work had been crushing me, and I just needed some time away from everything. No emails, no calls, no deadlines. Just silence, fresh air, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to get through. The listing described it as an isolated retreat. That should have been my first warning, but I booked it anyway. Getting there was harder than I expected. The directions took me off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that barely looked drivable. My car bounced over rocks and potholes, dust kicking up in thick clouds behind me. The trees on either side grew so close that their branches scraped against my windows, like fingers dragging along the glass. There was no cell service. I wasn't surprised. I had lost bars miles back. But still, the silence in my car felt heavier once I noticed it. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the cabin. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already starting to set. The place was small, just a one-room structure with a tin roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows coated in a layer of dust. A single chimney jutted from the side, connected to the old wood stove inside. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well out back and an outhouse about 50 yards into the trees. The forest pressed in thick from all sides. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. Something about the place felt wrong, not in a supernatural way. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or anything like that, but the silence was off. Too deep, like the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off and got out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the porch. The wooden planks creaked under my boots. The key was exactly where the owner had said it would be, under the loose board by the door. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. It smelled stale, like dust and old wood, like it had been sitting empty for a long time. The furniture was basic, a small table, 2 chairs, a cot against the far wall. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly in the corner, next to an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. I dropped my bag and let out a breath. The silence pressed in. I tried not to let it get to me. I got a fire going in the wood stove, heated up a can of soup, and ate in silence. Outside, the last bit of daylight faded, and the darkness settled in fast. I hadn't realized just how deep I was in the woods until then. There were no distant headlights, no hum of traffic, just blackness pressing against the windows. I stepped onto the porch to get some air. The trees loomed around me, stretching high into the sky. The stars were bright, but they did little to cut through the darkness below. The air was still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Then a sound, soft, far away, a branch snapping underfoot. I stiffened, my eyes searching the darkness. Nothing, just trees, probably an animal, a deer maybe. I went inside and locked the door. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin. Then a creak from the porch. I held my breath. Could have been the wood settling. That's what I told myself. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I sat up, my pulse hammering. Then the doorknob, turning, slowly. I grabbed my hunting knife from my bag and gripped it tight. The knob rattled once more, then stopped. Silence. I didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then soft footsteps moving away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep. At sunrise, I went outside, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, barefoot. They circled the cabin, stopping by the door. My stomach twisted. I scanned the trees, every instinct in me screaming to run. But my car was still parked where I left it, untouched. Whoever had been out here hadn't messed with it, which meant they didn't want me to leave. Not yet. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker. Maybe someone got lost. But I knew that wasn't true. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood, fetching water from the well, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. By the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. I locked the door, checked it twice, sat by the fire with the knife in my lap, listening, waiting. It started earlier this time. The footsteps, circling the cabin, stopping just outside the window. Then a tap, soft, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then a sound I'll never forget. A breath, right outside the window. Slow, steady, like someone was standing there, watching me. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then soft footsteps retreating into the woods. I sat there until the fire died. I didn't sleep. I made my decision the second the sun came up. I was leaving. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside, and stepped onto the porch. The woods felt different, like they were waiting. I ran to my car, heart pounding. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, my hands shaking. The wires had been cut. I turned, scanning the trees. The silence pressed in. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bag and ran. I don't know how long I ran. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. But I didn't stop. Then finally, the road. A single car coming around the bend. I stumbled into the street, waving my arms. The driver slammed on the brakes. I never went back. I don't know who or what was in those woods, but I know this: they let me go because they wanted me to remember. I always camped alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just liked it that way. No distractions, no small talk, just me and the woods. It was the one place where I didn't have to think about anything except the next fire, the next meal, the next morning. I had taken dozens of solo trips over the years, but this one was going to be the deepest I had ever gone. I had spent weeks planning it, tracing routes on the map, marking out possible sites. No trails, no roads, just deep forest and the promise of silence. I told myself this would be the trip I remembered for the rest of my life. I wasn't wrong. I left before sunrise, my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a hatchet, my rifle. The drive took 4 hours, the last 30 miles on a rough dirt road that felt like it hadn't been maintained in years. When I finally reached the spot where I had to leave my truck, I just sat there for a few minutes, staring at the tree line, feeling the weight of the isolation ahead. I stepped out, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The forest was dense, but the ground was clear, the kind of place where you could feel the silence settle in your bones. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a clearing near a slow-moving creek, set down my pack, and took a long drink from my canteen. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only movement was the water and the occasional bird flitting through the branches. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a rock face on one side. The kind of place where I could sit with my back against the stone, looking out at the woods, knowing nothing could come at me from behind. I set up my tent near the rock wall, cleared out a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a meal out of a vacuum-sealed bag, watching the flames flicker. That was the last normal moment of the trip. I woke up sometime after midnight, not to a sound, but to the lack of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just thick, suffocating stillness. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. A single, soft footstep. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere just beyond the glow of the fire. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, another footstep. Closer. I sat up slowly, gripping the rifle, my eyes scanning the darkness. My fire had burned too low to see far, just enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The eye strained my ears. Silence. After what felt like an hour, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer, curious about the fire. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I threw more wood on the fire, watching as the flames flared up, pushing back the dark. Then I saw it, a shape just at the edge of the light, tall, still, watching. I jerked my rifle up, my hands shaking. My breath came fast, shallow. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there for the rest of the night, my back against the rock, my rifle in my lap. Morning came slow. The woods were back to normal. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I had seen. Almost. I searched the ground where the figure had been.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was too deep in my own head. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the day gathering wood, walking the area, trying to focus on anything except the lingering unease. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself to stay another night. That was a mistake. I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse jump. Every shift in the wind made me grip my rifle tighter. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The zipper on my tent. Moving. Something was outside. Something was trying to get in. I lunged for my rifle, yanked back the bolt. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, footsteps, fast, retreating into the trees. I sat there, my pulse slamming in my ears, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. I didn't sleep after that. Dawn was slow. I crawled out of my tent, my body stiff with tension. The air was cold, the fire just smoldering coals. Then I saw it, a single handprint on the outside of my tent. Not an animal, not my imagination, a human handprint. It was time to leave.
I packet fast. No break fast, no lingering.
I stuffed my gear into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started walking. I moved fast, almost running. The woods felt different now, watching, waiting. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Then, after a few miles, I saw something that made my stomach turn to ice. A tree, with something carved into the bark. My name. I turned and ran. The rest of the hike was a blur. Just the pounding of my boots, the hammering of my pulse. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my truck just as the sun dipped below the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, in the rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the tree line, watching. I slammed the truck into drive, tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not breathing until I hit pavement. I never went back. I've always loved being alone in the wild. Out there, nothing feels fake. No deadlines, no people, no noise. Just the sounds of the forest and the rhythm of survival. That's why I planned this trip. I wanted to push deeper into the woods than I ever had before. No trails, no designated campsites. Just pure, untouched wilderness. I studied maps for weeks, marking a spot deep in a remote national forest, miles from any known trails. The plan was simple. Drive as far as I could, hike in for a full day, and camp by a secluded river. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, a knife, a hatchet, a rifle. Not for hunting, but for protection. The deep woods don't just have bears and cougars. Sometimes they have worse things. The first few hours were easy. Paved roads, gas stations, signs of civilization. But those faded fast. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt. My truck rattled over deep ruts, branches scraping the sides. I didn't see another vehicle for almost an hour. Finally, I reached the end of the road, a small, unmarked clearing. No signs, no paths, just forest. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. Nothing. No birds. No wind. Just silence. I grabbed my pack, locked up the truck, and started walking. At first, the hike was peaceful. The old logging road I followed was overgrown but visible, a thin path cutting through the trees. My boots crunched on dry leaves. My pack pressed heavy against my back. But then, a few miles in, something felt wrong. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no insects, just my own breathing. I told myself it was normal. The deeper you go, the quieter things get. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By late afternoon, I reached the river. It was slow-moving, dark and wide, with a rocky shoreline and thick trees pressing in from all sides. No signs of people. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering light. That was the last time I felt safe. I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers. The air inside my tent was cold. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too careful. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The steps circled my camp, moving just beyond the firelight. Then silence. Whoever it was, they had stopped. I lay there, knife in hand, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. At sunrise, everything felt normal again. The fear from the night before seemed almost silly. Probably just a deer. Then I saw them. Footprints. Barefoot. Too big to be mine. And they weren't there yesterday. I scanned the trees, heart pounding. Nothing. I forced myself to go about my day, fishing, collecting firewood, keeping busy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept the fire burning bright, sat with my rifle across my lap, staring into the trees. The silence felt thicker than before. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, breathing, slow, heavy, like someone standing just beyond the firelight. I didn't move, didn't blink. The breathing stopped. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time. I gripped my rifle, every nerve on edge. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence. I didn't sleep that night. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that the stress of isolation was messing with me. But I couldn't ignore what I saw. More footprints. This time, they were closer to my tent. And they weren't just walking. They had been standing there, watching. I packed up my camp fast. I wasn't staying another night. I moved quickly, retracing my steps back toward my truck. But after an hour, something felt off. The landscape looked different. I should have been following the river, but it was gone. I checked my compass. I was going the wrong way, but that didn't make sense. I had been following my own tracks. It was like something had led me away. I set up a small fire in a clearing, too exhausted to keep moving. I kept my rifle close, eyes scanning the dark. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the firelight. Tall, still, watching. My blood turned to ice. I raised my rifle, and it vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gun in hand, listening to the woods breathe around me. At first light, I moved, fast. I didn't care about my tracks, about the noise. I just wanted out. After what felt like hours, I saw something through the trees. My truck. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I sprinted the last few steps, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Then, as I reached for the ignition, I froze. There was something in the dirt, right in front of my truck. Footprints, leading out of the woods, and they weren't mine. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But one thing is certain. The woods aren't empty.